Let us turn in our Bibles to the Gospel of Matthew and chapter 5. Matthew's Gospel, chapter 5. During the past week, we've had the results of the 2021 census on religion. For the first time since the census incorporated a question on religion, the number of people in England and Wales identifying as Christian is now less than 50%. At the same time as people identifying as Christian is rapidly declining, the number of people choosing to identify with no religion is rapidly increasing. The statistics confirm what we have known and suspected for some time, and that is the increasing secularization of our society. And with that increasing secularization comes a decreasing awareness of what is contained in this great book. Whereas 30 or 40 years ago, you would have come across many people who would have known some of the well-known stories of the Bible. And that is no longer the case. And yet, in spite of this rapid decline in Bible knowledge, what is perhaps the most familiar part of the Bible is Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And that is not so much because people have continued to read it, and far less because people have understood it, but it's because some of the language that Jesus used has found its way into our own language. As I pointed out a few weeks ago, you will still hear people referring to someone as being the salt of the earth. People will talk about an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. People will still say, "Judge not, that ye be not judged." How many times have you heard someone talk about turning the other cheek or going the extra mile? Well, if you ask people where those phrases and concepts originate from, you may get a blank look and a long silence. But their continued usage does demonstrate the effect which Jesus' sermon has had upon our English language. The bigger question, however, is what effect has his sermon had, not upon our language, but upon our lives? That is the bigger question. And for those of us who claim to be followers of this Jesus, that is the important question. And I say that because back in chapter 5, verse 20, Jesus said to his disciples, "For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven." And what we've had from that point in the sermon has been several examples of what Jesus meant back there in verse 20. What we've had from verse 21 are several examples of how the citizens of God's kingdom are to be characterized by a righteousness which is different from that of the Pharisees in Jesus' day. That is still the point that Jesus is making in these closing sections of chapter 5. And as he does so, we learn several things. And the first is in verses 33 to 37. And there we learn about the Christian's integrity in what we say to people. The Christian's integrity in what we say to people. Now, as he's done at the start of the previous three sections, Jesus begins this one with a reminder of what the religious teachers have been saying down through the years. "You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, 'Do not break your oaths, but keep the oaths you have made to the Lord.' But I tell you, do not swear at all." Now, as on the previous occasions, what they were saying sounded like a quote from the Old Testament law, but it wasn't quite. And as on the previous occasions, what Jesus says may have sounded like a rewriting of the Old Testament law, but it certainly wasn't. Yes, there were Old Testament laws relating to oaths. For example, Leviticus 19, verse 12 says, "You shall not swear by my name falsely, and so profane the name of your God." The emphasis was on swearing falsely. The point of the law was that you had to keep the oath you had taken. But what was happening by Jesus' day is that people were abusing the whole concept of the oath. Yes, they were saying you had to keep those oaths which you made to the Lord. But as long as you didn't use the Lord's name in your oath, you didn't need to keep it. And so by swearing by someone other than God, they gave the impression that their promises would be kept, when in actual fact they assumed that they didn't need to be kept. Rather than being a means of guaranteeing one's honesty, their oaths had become a cloak to cover up their dishonesty. So much so that Jesus says in verse 37 that anything beyond a simple and straightforward yes or no comes from the evil one. And it is against that background that Jesus says, verse 34, "But I tell you, do not swear at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by the earth, for it is God's footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King." In other words, says Jesus, just because you don't swear by God's name, that doesn't mean that you don't need to keep your word. The eternal God is God of heaven and earth. And therefore, no matter what you're swearing by, whether it be by heaven or whether it be by earth or whether it be by Jerusalem, it is all part of God's domain and therefore comes under his sovereign authority. Even the hairs on your head, says Jesus, come under his universal authority, verse 36. And therefore, swearing by your head does not escape the authority of God. And so regardless of what you swear by, you are invoking God's name and God's authority in one way or another. And so that being the case, rather than swearing by this or that or 1,001 other things, it's much better, says Jesus, verse 37, that simply let your yes be yes and your no be no. Now, because of these words of Jesus, Christians down through the years have assumed that it's wrong to take an oath of any description and under any circumstance, including the oath at the start of legal proceedings in court. That is how I used to understand these verses. And so the only time I've been summoned to appear in court, as a witness, I hasten to add, the only time I've been summoned to appear in court, I declined to take the Bible and I declined to repeat the oath. I thought, as a Christian, that was the right thing to do. If I were to find myself in that position now, I'm not sure I would do the same thing, and I say that for a number of reasons. Firstly, as I've already said, Old Testament law did include laws concerning oaths, and therefore for Jesus to issue a blanket ban on oaths of any description would be a rewriting of the Old Testament law. Secondly, according to Hebrews 6, verse 17, God has confirmed certain things with an oath. Thirdly, there are numerous occasions throughout his letters when the Apostle Paul effectively takes an oath to confirm the truthfulness of what he is saying. Romans 1 verse 9, God is my witness. 2 Corinthians 1 verse 23, I call God as my witness. 1 Thessalonians 2 verse 5, God is our witness. And fourthly, and perhaps most convincingly of all, Jesus himself recognized the place of an oath in legal proceedings and was prepared to give evidence under oath. In chapter 6 of this gospel, you read of that occasion when Jesus appeared before the Sanhedrin. Having refused to answer the charges brought against him in verse 62 of Matthew 26, the high priest then said this to him, I charge you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. The difference now is that Jesus is now given evidence under oath. And so he breaks his silence and he says, yes, it is as you say. And so for those reasons, it's perhaps better not to take Jesus' words in Matthew 5 as being a blanket ban on the taking of oaths, full stop. But what Jesus is speaking out against is the irreverent trivializing of oaths, whereby we add one to the end of every second sentence. You've come across people who speak like that, haven't you? But why do they need to do that? Why should we need to swear by something or someone in order to be believed? In order to be believed by our family, our friends, our colleagues at work, those around us. Why can't people take our word at face value and take our yes to mean yes and our no to mean no? Our speech ought to be marked by such integrity, says Jesus. Because as Jesus has just made clear in his reference to heaven and earth and Jerusalem and our head, the whole earth is the Lord's and everything in it, to quote Psalm 24, his presence and his authority extends to every area and aspect of life in this world, and therefore no matter where you are or what we are doing, God is a witness to what we say. You can't escape from him. Whether you take the oath or not, he is a witness to what you say. And therefore we ought to speak truthfully and honestly. We ought to speak truthfully and honestly regardless of whether it be in a court of law and under oath, or whether we be amongst family and friends and colleagues. The point that Jesus is making to his followers back then and to us today is that as citizens of his kingdom, we ought to be people whose word can be trusted. In sharp contrast to many in his day, and in sharp contrast to many in our day, sadly, we ought to be people who are known for integrity in what we say. Secondly, verses 38 to 42, and there we learn about the Christian's grace and how we respond to people. The Christian's grace and how we respond to people. Now, unlike the previous four quotations that Jesus gives, this one in verse 38 is found in the Old Testament law. For example, Deuteronomy 19 verse 21 says, show no pity, life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. But although those words were still remembered correctly and accurately by the teachers of the law in Jesus' day, what had been forgotten by them was the original context in which those words were originally given. If you look at the Deuteronomy 19 passage, you will see that the context is all about legal proceedings within Old Testament Israel. And that is why there are references in that passage to judges, there are references to witnesses, there are references to various other legal matters in that Deuteronomy 19 passage. And this law was given so that Israel's judicial system might be both just and free. A life taken was to be punished by the taking of a life and nothing less. A tooth lost in assault was to be paid for by a tooth, or an equivalent compensation, as explained in Exodus 21, but nothing more. You didn't lose your life for taking a tooth. It was a law which prevented ever-increasing and escalating violence, whereby a tooth knocked out by someone could lead to them having their head knocked off. The law was there to prevent that from happening. It was a law which prevented Israel's legal system from becoming flabby and easygoing in its punishment of crime, and at the same time it prevented it from becoming overly zealous in its punishment of crime. It was a law which ensured that the punishment was to fit the crime, nothing less and nothing more. But please note, it was a law concerning the state's punishment of crime. And it wasn't a license for personal revenge. Whereas by Jesus' day it was taken out of context and it was commonly applied to people's personal dealings with one another. It was used as an excuse for personal revenge, personal retaliation. It was used as an excuse for bearing grudges. It was used as an excuse for ruthless, harsh, tit-for-tat dealings between people. But says Jesus to his disciples, that's not how you should respond to people. Instead, do not resist an evil person. Now, that does not mean, as some people have taken it over the years, that does not mean that we shouldn't have a police force or an army. That's how it's been taken by some people. But if you read other passages, for example, Romans 13, you'll see very clearly what the role of the state is in restraining an evil person. But Jesus here is not speaking about the responsibilities of the state. Instead, he is speaking about how we respond as individual people, and especially as Christian people, when someone insults us. And I use the word insult deliberately because the illustration that Jesus goes on to give about being struck on the right cheek, that was more of an insult than a violent crime within that culture. And so says Jesus, if someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. In other words, says Jesus, rather than seeking revenge, rather than retaliating, rather than trading insult for insult, we love to do that. Rather than trading insult for insult, simply let them insult you. That is the Christian's demonstration of grace in the way we respond. Likewise, verse 40, if someone wants to sue you and take your tunic, let them have your cloak as well. Now, the tunic was the long garment worn on the inside, while the cloak was worn on the outside. It was the cloak that kept you warm, especially at night, and therefore the cloak was considered to be precious. The cloak was considered to be very important, especially if it was a cold day like this, so much so that there were Old Testament laws. Did you know there were Old Testament laws ensuring that you were not left without your cloak by the end of the day? Exodus 22. Your cloak was protected by law. That's how important it was. But what Jesus is saying here is that if someone were to take you to court over your tunic, you should let them have your cloak as well. The very thing which the law ensures that you're able to keep. even that is something that you should be willing to relinquish if need be. And the point that Jesus is making is that when faced with opposition, we should be willing, if need be, to even forfeit our rights on occasions, rather than standing hard and fast on our rights. That is the grace the Christian ought to demonstrate in the way we respond. Likewise, verse 41, if someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. First century Israel was under Roman occupation, and a Roman soldier had the right to temporarily conscript a civilian to carry his luggage or whatever it was for a certain distance. That is why you may remember as Jesus is led away to Calvary, Simon of Cyrene, he's forced by the Roman soldiers to carry the cross of Jesus. They had that legal right. But legally, they could only demand that you did so for a certain distance. A mile in Jesus' illustration. But says Jesus, look, if someone makes such demands upon you, don't just fulfill your duty by going the 1 mile and no further. Go another additional mile with him. Likewise, verse 42, give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. Now, I appreciate that these 4 scenarios in verses 39 to 42, they raise all sorts of questions. And they raise all sorts of questions about how this should be worked out in practice in everyday life. And you know the questions, because it's questions that have gone through your mind as well. No matter when you go down Bangor High Street or go up to Upper Bangor, you're faced with these sort of issues. Questions about whether we should give to people who are asking if our giving simply encourages their laziness. Questions about whether we should give to people when we're not sure how they're going to spend it. And all those sort of questions. The list of questions is endless. And can I just say there are no easy answers to some of those questions. No easy answers. But whatever the precise implications of these verses may be in particular circumstances, I think we can understand the general thrust of what Jesus is saying, can we not? He's saying that rather than be characterized by revenge and retaliation in our personal dealings with people, we ought to be people who graciously accept an insult if need be. Rather than be people who demand our rights at all costs, we ought to be people who are willing to relinquish our rights if need be. Rather than being people who will only help as much as we are obliged to, we ought to be people who demonstrate a willingness to help. Rather than being people who are tight with our time and our talents and our treasures, we ought to be people who are generous in giving those things in order to help others. That is the grace the Christian ought to demonstrate as we respond to people and respond to their circumstances. And in response, you may be thinking to yourself, oh, it's all very well telling us those things. But do we know of anyone who's actually practiced these principles in real life, in the real world? Can you tell me, preacher, someone who's actually done this sort of thing? And the answer is yes. There is someone who has practiced all this. And the fascinating thing is that the person who has practiced them is the very same person who first taught them. If ever any man practiced what he preached, it was this Jesus. If ever someone was prepared to accept an insult without retaliating, it was Jesus. If ever someone was prepared to relinquish his rights It was Jesus. You wouldn't be celebrating Christmas this year if he didn't do that. If ever someone was prepared to go the extra mile in helping others, it was Jesus. If ever someone was generous in responding to the needs of others, it was Jesus. Those principles were demonstrated. They were demonstrated throughout his life. But I hope you appreciate that they were not only demonstrated in the life of Jesus, they were especially and supremely in the death of Jesus. And what Jesus is saying is that although the state has a God-given responsibility to ensure that the punishment fits the crime as prescribed by Old Testament law, when it comes to our personal dealings with people, when it comes to our personal interaction with people, Jesus is saying that our attitude, to use the words of Paul in Philippians 2 verse 5, our attitude should be the same as that of Christ Jesus. That is the grace. That is the grace the Christian ought to demonstrate in the way we respond to people. Thirdly, verses 43 to 47. And there we see the Christian's love in how we relate to people. The Christian's love in how we relate to people. Now, whereas in the previous section the teachers of Jesus' day were quoting correctly from the Old Testament law but forgetting its context, here in this section they are completely misquoting the Old Testament law. Whereas the Old Testament scripture says, love your neighbour, Leviticus 19 verse 18, what they were saying was, verse 43, they were saying, love your neighbour and hate your enemy. They had taken the commandment about loving your neighbour to mean that they were to love their neighbour only and hate everyone else in the process. The result was that they loved the people around them, their own family, their own friends, their fellow countrymen, but they despised everybody else. And it was to correct that misinterpretation that Jesus says, verse 44, but I tell you, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. We've all watched young people grow up, and when they demonstrate mannerisms or attitudes that's similar to that of their parents, we say they are a chip off the old block. If it's a young lad who demonstrates a similarity to his father, we say like father, like son. And that is precisely what Jesus means here when he says that by loving our enemies, we will be sons of our Father in heaven. By loving our enemies, we will be demonstrating a family likeness. By loving our enemies, we will be demonstrating a like father, like son attitude towards our enemies. Back in verse 12, in the Beatitudes, Jesus said that if we suffer persecution for the sake of righteousness, we are aligning ourselves with the prophets. But now he's saying that if we love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us, we are aligning ourselves with the very character of God. Because that is precisely how God has treated his enemies. For example, how many times have those of you from Anglesey, you've come to church and you've said, you know what, it was raining over there, it's bone dry here. Well, it's usually the other way around, but that's by the way. And that is understandable, because the rain has to start and stop somewhere, does it not? And if you're driving a distance, then you can sometimes see the exact place in the road, usually in Menai Bridge, where that happens. But wouldn't you be a little bit surprised if not only was it still raining when you got to Bangor, but wouldn't you be a little bit surprised if you walked through Bangor and found that although a whole street was suffering a torrential downpour, one house in the middle of the street was enjoying glorious sunshine? Wouldn't you find that a little bit strange? That would surprise you, would it not? And you'd be left wondering, I wonder what's so special about the people who live in that house. They must be in God's good books. They must be in the right with God. Well, it may well be that out of all the people who live in that street, it may well be that there is one family who are in the right with God. The righteous, as Jesus calls them in verse 45. But what you find, says Jesus, is that when God sends the rain or when God brings out the sunshine, he doesn't single out the righteous for special treatment. Instead, the whole street, the righteous and the unrighteous, the whole street gets the rain or the sunshine. You see, when it comes to the dispensing of his creatorial and temporal blessings, such as the weather, the rain, the sunshine, when it comes to his dispensing of those things, God doesn't make a sharp distinction between the righteous and the unrighteous. He doesn't discriminate between his friends and his enemies. And if we want to demonstrate a family likeness to our Father in heaven, then neither should we. Don't you find it so easy to discriminate in the way you treat people and in the way you relate to people? We do it unconsciously. We've got time for some people, but not others. We'll treat some people with respect, but not others. We will love some people, but not others. And surprise, surprise, would you believe it? The people we love, they tend to be those who love us. The people we greet, the people we befriend, they tend to be those who belong to the same family as us, the same social circle as us, the same little clique as us. And in response, you may be thinking to yourself, but hang on, surely that's only natural, is it not? Yes, it is natural, says Jesus, perfectly natural. And that's why you find that sort of thing happening all across the world. All across the world. For example, says Jesus in verse 46, even rotten, sinful, corrupt first century tax collectors, even they know how to show a measure of love and respect for those within their own little corrupt circle. Even pagans, verse 47, they greet and befriend those of their own kind. It's natural. Happens all over the world. But as citizens of Christ's kingdom, says Jesus, we ought to be different. Unlike those who only have time for their own, and unlike those who only show respect to those within their own clique or clan, and unlike those who will only love those whom they know will love them in return, those of us who belong to Jesus Christ and his kingdom, we ought to demonstrate a different type of love in our dealings with other people. We are to demonstrate a love that reaches out. We are to demonstrate a love that crosses the conventional boundaries and barriers of class, creed, colour and culture. We are to demonstrate a love says Jesus, that extends to our enemies as well as our friends. That is the Christian's love and how we relate to people. 3 things Jesus says, and just to warn you, I'm not quite finished yet. 3 things Jesus said should characterize the citizens of his kingdom. Firstly, the Christian's integrity in what we say to people. Secondly, the Christian's grace in how we respond to people. Thirdly, the Christian's love in how we relate to people. Now, if you've been with us over recent weeks, that is 6 times that you've heard Jesus say since verse 21. That is 6 times you've heard him say, you have heard that it was said, but I tell you. Do you see now how our righteousness ought to be different from that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law in Jesus' day? I think Jesus has made it perfectly clear how our practical day-to-day outworking of God's commandments ought to be very different from that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law in Jesus' day. He's made it clear that the difference ought to be enormous. But please note, although we are to be different from the Pharisees in how we live, it is not the Pharisees who are our benchmark for Christian living. Instead, says Jesus, it is the very character of God himself. And that is why, as Jesus brings this section of his sermon to a close, he says this, verse 48, he says, "Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect." Now, I don't want to disappoint you this morning, but in this life, we will never be perfect as God is perfect. But that shouldn't stop us. That shouldn't stop us from aiming to becoming more like him. That shouldn't stop us from longing that his character is increasingly seen in our character and conduct. And it is for that purpose and with that great goal in sight that Jesus has taught us how the commandments ought to be understood and how the commandments ought to be worked out in the lives of those who belong to his kingdom. Because don't forget, the commandments are an expression of God's character. And therefore, as we seek to implement those commandments in our daily lives as they ought to be implemented, as we seek to implement those commandments in our daily lives as Jesus says they should be implemented, our great goal should be to increasingly become more like our Father in heaven. As he is perfect, so let us do all that we possibly can through putting into practice what Jesus has taught us. Let us do all that we possibly can to become more like our Father.